Hey guys, tonight we begin with a medieval bureaucrat, the most dangerous creature in history, hunched over a flickering candle in some drafty French courthouse, scratching out a death warrant for a pig. You're there in the stuffy chamber, the air thick with ink, sweat, and the faint oink of the accused echoing from the holding pen outside. The Middle Ages were full of bizarre laws, but what most people don't know is that many of them existed because of one incredibly stupid, chaotic, or downright unbelievable event. You probably won't survive this level of historical absurdity without at least one facepalm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the muddy streets of Falaise, Normandy, 1386, the kind of damp autumn morning where your boots squelch and the fog clings to your cloak like a bad decision. The town's abuzz, not with the usual market chatter or church bells, but with the scandal of the century. A pig is on trial for murder. Yes, a pig. You push through the crowd, elbowing past farmers and merchants to catch a glimpse of the defendant. There it is, a plump, pink creature with a snout smeared in something suspiciously like blood, chained to a post outside the courthouse. Its beady eyes dart around, utterly clueless that it's about to make legal history. The child it allegedly attacked, a toddler named Jahan, didn't make it, and the townsfolk, in their medieval wisdom, decided the culprit must face justice. Not a quick slaughter for bacon, mind you, but a full-blown trial with wigs, robes, and a defense attorney who's probably regretting every life choice that led him here. You squeeze into the courtroom, a cramped stone hall lit by tallow candles that smell like regret. The judge, a stern man with a beard that could hide a squirrel, bangs his gavel. Actually, just a hammer on a table, but it gets the point across. The prosecutor, a local bailiff with a flair for drama, lays out the case. This pig, on the morning of September 9th, 1386, wandered from its pen, entered the street, and with what he calls malice aforethought, attacked little Jahan, biting his face and causing fatal injuries. Malice aforethought? You stifle a laugh. This pig couldn't forethink its next meal, let alone a murder. But the Middle Ages didn't do nuance. The mainstream fact here, animal trials were real and documented across Europe from the 13th to 17th centuries, with pigs being the most frequent defendants because, well, they were everywhere and occasionally aggressive. Historians still argue whether these trials were genuine attempts at justice or elaborate theatrical punishments to reinforce human moral order. The defense attorney, a nervous fellow named Guillaume, stands up, sweating through his robes. His argument? The pig acted on instinct, not intent. It was hungry, the child was in its path, and nature took its course. He even calls a witness, Farmer, who swears the pig was a gentle soul that once shared apples with his dog. The crowd murmurs. You lean forward, captivated by the absurdity. Guillaume tries a bold move. He questions whether a beast can even commit a crime in the eyes of God. The judge, unimpressed, cites ecclesiastical law that all creation falls under divine jurisdiction. The quirky tidbit: some pigs got better representation than human peasants, with appointed lawyers and appeals to higher courts. One case in 1457 saw a sow and her 6 piglets tried separately. The piglets were acquitted for being too young to sin. The trial drags on for hours. Witnesses testify. A baker saw the pig snarling with intent. A midwife claims it looked possessed. You're munching on a stale bread crust, wondering if this is peak medieval entertainment. The jury, 12 grim-faced men who probably just want to go home, deliberates for all of 10 minutes. Guilty. The sentence: death by hanging. You follow the procession to the gallows, a rickety wooden structure usually reserved for thieves. The pig, now dressed in a tiny shirt and breeches for added humiliation, is led up the steps. The crowd cheers as the noose tightens. You can't help but feel a pang. This is Bacon with a backstory. The executioner, a burly man with a soft spot for irony, pulls the lever. The pig kicks, squeals, and it's over. The town erupts in celebration, as if justice has been served with a side of ham. But the ripples don't stop there. The bishop of the diocese, horrified that lay people are executing animals without church oversight, steps in. Animal trials were spiritually dicey. Did the pig have a soul? Could it be damned? A new law emerges. No animal can be tried or executed without ecclesiastical approval. You imagine the paperwork. Application to Hangso, Form EC 666. This precedent spreads like wildfire. Soon, courts across Europe are busy with beastly defendants. In 1379, 2 herds of pigs in Burgundy were excommunicated for trampling a child. A cock in Basel, 1474, was burned at the stake for laying an egg, seen as sorcery. Historians still argue whether these trials reflected genuine belief in animal culpability or were symbolic acts to restore cosmic order after tragedy. You wander the town square, post-execution, the air still buzzing. A local scribe chats you up, boasting how Falaise's pig trial inspired a wave of animal accountability. Roosters faced charges for crowing too loudly, disturbing the peace. Goats were fined for eating vineyard grapes, trespassing with style. One fringe tidbit: in 1519, moles in Stelvio, Italy, were formally excommunicated and ordered to leave town within 3 days, with safe passage promised if they complied. You picture the moles packing tiny bindles, scurrying off into the sunset. The pig's legacy lingers in legal annals. Manuscripts from the period detail procedures. Animals got summons read aloud in their pens, rights to counsel, even appeals. One pig in 1394 had its sentence commuted to branding because the owner paid a hefty fine. You chuckle at the thought of a pig with a hot iron G for guilty on its flank. But beneath the farce, there's a darker truth. In a world where plague, famine, and war ravaged communities, blaming animals offered control. If a pig could be tried like a man, maybe chaos wasn't random. Maybe God's order prevailed, even in a barnyard. You stroll past the gallows, now empty, the pig's clothes fluttering in the breeze like a ghost. The town's already back to normal. Vendors hawking ale, kids chasing chickens. But you know better. This wasn't just about one rogue hog. It was the spark that lit a bonfire of bizarre legislation. Laws banning pigs from streets without muzzles. Ordinances requiring bells on cattle to prevent surprise attacks. One town even mandated that sows wear aprons in public. Modesty for the morally suspect. Fast forward a bit in your mind's eye. By the 16th century, animal trials peak. In 1522, rats in Autun, France, get a lawyer who argues they couldn't appear in court due to travel dangers. Cats, dogs, floods. The judge adjourns for safer summons. You're grinning now. Medieval logic at its finest. Historians still argue whether the famous advocate Barthélemy de Chassaneuz, who defended those rats, used the case to launch his career, or genuinely believed in rodent rights. Back in Falaise, you overhear monks debating the pig's soul. One insists animals can't sin. Another counters that Satan uses beasts as vessels. The quirky detail: some executed animals were buried in consecrated ground, others in unhallowed beast cemeteries to avoid spiritual contamination. You picture a pig graveyard with tiny headstones. Here lies Snuffles, hanged for hunger. The trial's fame spreads. Ballads are sung in taverns. The pig of Falaise, with malice in its eyes. Minstrels embellish. The pig wore a crown, plotted with witches. You hum along, sipping watery ale. The mainstream fact: over 200 documented animal trials exist, from Switzerland to Spain, with pigs topping the list at nearly 50 cases. Why pigs? They roamed freely, scavenged in streets, and when hungry or cornered, lashed out. Plus, they were valuable. Killing one meant compensation, but trying it first added gravitas. You linger as the sun sets, painting the sky blood orange, fitting for the day's events. The pig's owner, a poor farmer, weeps in the corner. He'll get no meat. The carcass is evidence, burned to prevent demonic return. Tough break, but the law's the law, even for livestock. This event births a cascade of regulations. No unsupervised pigs in town limits. Mandatory pens with locks. One decree fines owners if their sow looks at a child askance. You roll your eyes. Medieval profiling. The broader impact. It reinforces the idea that everything in God's creation is accountable. If a pig can hang, so can you for lesser crimes. It's control disguised as piety. You ponder this as stars prick the sky. Historians still argue whether the Falaise trial was the first, or if earlier, unrecorded cases existed. Some point to a 1266 pig execution in Fontenay-aux-Roses, but details are murky. You drift through the quieting streets, the trial's echoes fading. But tomorrow, another animal might wander, another law be born. The pig of Falaise wasn't just dinner interrupted, it was the chaotic spark that proved even hooves could shake empires of bureaucracy. You yawn, the absurdity settling like dust. One pig, one trial, 1,000 ridiculous rules, and you thought your HOA was bad. The story doesn't end with the hanging. Chronicles note the pig's executioner kept its tail as a trophy, wore it in his hat for years. Quirky, sure. Townsfolk swore the gallows creaked on windy nights. The pig's ghost seeking revenge. Superstition. But in 1386, who's splitting hairs or tails? You imagine future trials. A dog in 1445, accused of theft, defended by claiming it was fetching, not stealing. Or weevils in 1587 summoned for eating grain, their lawyer pleading infestation as act of God. The legal creativity is chef's kiss. Mainstream. These trials often ended in execution to satisfy community outrage, but acquittals happened if evidence was weak, like a piglet too small to reach the victim. As you fade from the scene, the lesson lingers. Medieval justice didn't discriminate. It equalized man and beast under the gavel. Stupid? Absolutely. But in a world of uncertainty, it was certainty in chains. The pig lost, but bureaucracy won. And you, dear listener, you're just getting started on this parade of historical nonsense. The ripple effect hits neighboring towns. In 1394, a sow in Claremont is tried for eating a baby's arm. Partial consumption, partial guilt. The owner pays damages, so exiled to the woods. Exile for pigs? Now that's a policy. You smirk, picturing border patrols checking for porcine passports. Deeper still, the church's role. Bishops profited from trial fees, indulgences for owners who confessed negligence. It's a racket wrapped in rosaries. Historians still argue whether Pope Innocent II's 1450s bull on animal trials encouraged or merely tolerated them. Texts are ambiguous, motives murkier. You're back in the courtroom in your mind, the pig's oinks haunting. The attorney Guillaume, he quits law, becomes a hermit. Can't blame him. Defending dinner is soul-crushing. The judge retires rich from fines. Justice served, medieval style. One more tidbit. Some pigs got last meals. Bread and wine, mocking communion. Sacrilege or sympathy? You decide. The Falaise pig dined on apples, reportedly its favorite. Even in death, preferences honored. The law evolves. By 1400s, animal advocates, yes, they existed, push for mercy. One lawyer argues pigs lack reason, thus no sin. Courts counter, intent inferred from action. Philosophy meets pork. You stretch, the tail's weight settling. This pig didn't just die. It legislated. From courtroom to gallows, it birthed a menagerie of mandates. And you thought traffic court was wild. The crowd disperses, but stories multiply. The pig spoke Latin in dreams, warned of plague, nonsense, but folklore fills gaps. History leaves, mainstream closure. Animal trials decline by 1700s with Enlightenment rationality. Last recorded in 1750, a French dog hanged for biting. Progress, slowly. You whisper to the night. One pig, eternal legacy, absurdity immortalized. You're in a bohemian tilt yard in the 1370s, the sun glinting off polished helms, and the air thick with the tang of horse sweat and fresh-cut grass. Trumpets blare, banners snap in the breeze, and the crowd roars for the next joust. But today's spectacle isn't another pair of knights thundering toward each other with lances leveled. It's a nobleman named Václav of Krumlov, grinning like a fox in a henhouse, leading his squire to the starting line. That squire? A goose, not a metaphor, not a roasted entree. A live, hissing goose, decked out in custom plate armor that clinks with every furious waddle. You're pressed against the wooden barrier, ale sloshing in your hand, wondering if someone spiked the communal barrel with visions. The mainstream fact: medieval tournaments were highly regulated displays of martial skill, but chroniclers confirm that parody entries, animals in armor, did occasionally appear as noble pranks, especially in Central Europe, where Bohemian courts loved theatrical absurdity. The goose, dubbed Sir Hiss of the Pond by its smirking owner, wears a tiny bassinet helmet, complete with a plume-dyed goose gray for camouflage. Its breastplate is hammered from scrap iron, wings strapped into articulated pauldrons that flap uselessly. A miniature lance, really just a sharpened stick, is tied to its beak with silk ribbon. Václav bows theatrically to the grandstand where the Duke and his court watch, stone-faced except for one duchess hiding giggles behind a fan. Historians still argue whether Václav intended harmless satire or was genuinely bored enough to believe poultry could replace squires. The chronicles lean toward the former, but the aftermath suggests the latter got out of hand fast. The joust begins. Václav's opponent, a knight named Otto von Rosenberg, charges down the list on a destrier the size of a small cottage. You feel the ground tremble. Sir Hiss, released from its handler, flaps into the center of the field in a metallic whirlwind. The crowd erupts, half laughter, half horror. The goose, sensing freedom or maybe just lunch, barrels straight for Otto's horse. Its tiny lance jabs the destrier's fetlock. The horse rears, Otto tumbles in a crash of steel and dignity, and three squires rush to grab the bird. One gets a vicious peck to the hand. Blood wells instantly. Sir Hiss honks triumphantly, then rams headfirst into a wooden barrier, denting its own helmet. Feathers explode like confetti. You're wheezing with laughter. Ale forgotten. Chaos blooms. Otto's horse bolts, scattering spectators. Another knight's palfrey panics and unseats its rider into the lap of a bishop who was already having a bad day after losing at dice. The quirky tidbit: the goose survived the initial crash, but later succumbed to what the chronicler delicately calls internal clanging, meaning its armor crushed its ribcage during the rampage. Václav, still mounted, tries to restore order by shouting, "Yield, foul, foul," but the crowd's too busy placing side bets on whether the bishop will excommunicate the bird. By the time the dust settles, three knights nurse bruises, one squire needs stitches, and the tilt yard looks like a blacksmith's nightmare. Scattered gauntlets, a bent lance, and goose feathers stuck to everything. The Duke, face purple with rage or embarrassment, hard to tell, demands an inquiry. You trail the officials to the castle hall, where Václav defends himself with the straight-faced claim that Sir Hiss was nobly born of pond lineage and thus qualified. The council isn't buying it. Within days, a decree is nailed to every tavern door in Bohemia. No beast, bird, or barnyard creature shall be armored, or mounted in imitation of noble combatants, under penalty of fine and public mockery. The law extends to beasts of burden, fowl, and pets of domestic origin. Legalese for don't give your chicken a sword. You're in the scriptorium weeks later, watching a scribe copy the decree with a quill that keeps dripping. He mutters that this is the third animal-related law this year. Remember the pig? You nod. Word travels. The goose ban spreads faster than plague rumors. Moravia adopts it verbatim. Silesian dukes add a clause banning avian heraldry, just in case someone paints a goose on a shield. One fringe chronicle claims a Polish count tried to enter a armored turkey the next season. The bird was disqualified for excessive gobbling during the salute. You picture the judges measuring decibels with hourglasses. The law's enforcement is comedy gold. Tournament marshals now carry measuring tapes to check if any squire exceeds 2 feet in height. A suspicious duck is once detained for wearing a too shiny collar. Turns out it was just polished brass. Knights grumble, but secretly love the story. Sir Hiss becomes tavern legend. Bards sing of the goose that unhorsed 3 men and died a hero. Václav, fined the cost of a new destrier, retires the concept, but keeps the tiny armor as a fireplace decoration. You visit his hall years later. The goose helmet sits on a shelf, plume still jaunty, a silent reminder that stupidity sometimes wears feathers. Historians still argue whether the decree was the first formal animal armor ban or if earlier unwritten customs existed. Some point to a 12th century French tournament where a noble's pet monkey in chainmail caused similar havoc, but records are lost. The quirky detail. Bohemian armorers briefly marketed miniature jousting kits for noble children until the church labeled them gateway heresy. Sales plummeted. You wander Prague's markets, where goose-down pillows now carry a premium. Ironic tribute. Street performers reenact the joust with puppets. Kids cheer when the goose wins. The law stays on the books for decades. Cited in 1422, when a baron tries to enter an armored boar. The boar wins its heat, but is disqualified for unsportsmanlike rooting. You laugh until your sides ache. The broader impact? Tournament regulations tighten. No more surprise entrants. Squires must be human, literate, and preferably sober. One duke adds a no livestock clause to every invitation, just in case. The goose's ghost, or at least its reputation, haunts jousts forever. Knights swear they hear phantom honks before a bad tilt. Superstition or wind, you decide. You linger at the tilt yard's edge, now quiet. The grass has grown over the dents, but the story lives. One bored noble, one armored bird, one law to rule them all. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, absurdity had wings, and sometimes those wings were made of steel. You're in the dusty lists of a German tournament ground in 1364, the Holy Roman Empire's finest packed shoulder to shoulder under a sky the color of tarnished pewter. The air reeks of roasted chestnuts, horse dung, and the sour tang of anticipation. Trumpets squeal, lances splinter, and the crowd roars with every crash of steel on shield. But today's star isn't a sober knight in gleaming plate. It's Count Heinrich von Schwarzburg, swaying in his saddle like a sapling in a gale, eyes glassy, breath strong enough to pickle onions. He's drunk, gloriously, legendarily drunk, and he's convinced the alcohol is his secret weapon. You're wedged between a baker and a blacksmith, clutching a tankard of small beer, watching Heinrich drop his lance for the 3rd time, while bellowing, "Saint Michael guides my aim." The mainstream fact: jousting was the premier martial sport of medieval nobility, governed by strict codes, but chroniclers confirm that drunken participation was common enough that water was sometimes safer than the local well. Heinrich's opponent, a knight named Conrad von Falkenstein, waits at the far end, helm tucked under one arm, looking like he's reconsidering his life choices. The herald hesitates. Should he start the charge? Hinrich solves the dilemma by spurring his horse forward early, lance wobbling like a drunk compass. You feel the ground shake as the destrier lumbers down the list. Hinrich misses Conrad by a mile. The lance arcs wildly, skewers a prayer banner, and keeps going, straight into a monk who'd been kneeling at the sidelines, begging divine protection for everyone's safety. The monk, Brother Anselm, a gentle soul fond of illuminated manuscripts, takes the hit square in the ribs. He flies backward into a hay bale with a sound like a sack of turnips hitting cobblestones. The crowd gasps, then erupts into a mix of horror and helpless laughter. You're doubled over, tears streaming. This is peak medieval multitasking, prayer and puncture in one. Hinrich, oblivious, circles back, shouting, "A sign from heaven." The monk, miraculously alive, sits up clutching his side, habit torn, face pale, but indignant. "That was no sign," he wheezes. "That was a spear." Historians still argue whether Hinrich was genuinely pious or just using St. Michael as an excuse to day drink. The betting pools in the stands lean heavily toward the latter. The quirky tidbit: Brother Anselm survived with only bruised ribs and a newfound aversion to outdoor worship. He spent the rest of his life praying indoors, behind locked doors, just in case. The tournament halts. The local duke, Ludwig von Wittelsbach, storms onto the field, face redder than Hinrich's nose. He's had it. Last year, a drunk knight unhorsed the duke's cousin. The year before, another set a tent on fire with a misplaced torch. This monk spearing is the final straw. You follow the commotion to the castle's great hall, where an emergency council convenes under tapestries depicting sober saints. Hinrich, still tipsy, defends himself. Wine steadies the hand and calms the heart. The duke counters that a steady hand shouldn't impale clergy. Within hours, scribes draft Europe's first recorded anti-drunk jousting law. No knight shall compete in tournament or trial of arms while under the influence of drink or fermented brew, upon pain of disqualification and fine. It's the medieval equivalent of don't drink and drive, except the vehicle is a half-ton warhorse and the airbag is a praying monk. You're in the scriptorium the next morning, watching the decree copied in triplicate. The ink smells sharp, the scribe's hand trembling from last night's ale. He's exempt, being clergy. The law spreads faster than gossip. Bavaria adopts it by spring. Swabia adds a breath-sniffing clause. Marshals can lean in and smell a knight's helm before the tilt. One marshal reportedly faints from the fumes and is replaced by a teetotaler squire. You chuckle at the image. Medieval breathalyzers, powered by nose and prayer. Enforcement is creative, no alcohol meters. So, officials resort to the 3 questions test. Recite the Lord's Prayer backward, walk a straight line, and name the Duke's grandmother. Fail any, and you're benched. Hinrich fails spectacularly. He calls the grandmother Gertrude the Glorious. She was Brunhilde the Bearded. He's fined the cost of a new lance, and Brother Anselm's medical bills, mostly honey and willow bark. The quirky detail: some knights switch to mead, claiming it's less detectable. Marshals counter with honey-sniffing dogs. The dogs get drunk on the job and are retired to monasteries. You visit the tournament grounds weeks later. The atmosphere's different. Knights sip watered wine. Squires carry vinegar flasks to sober up fast. One enterprising vendor sells St. Michael's sobriety tonic, mostly mint and regret. The law's a hit with the church, who argue sober knights honor God. Knights grumble that sober knights lose sponsors. Ale companies were big donors. The great medieval debate begins. Piety versus party culture. You're in a tavern that night, eavesdropping as 2 knights argue. One insists alcohol sharpens focus. The other counters that focus shouldn't involve monks as targets. The barkeep settles it by cutting them off. The decree becomes imperial law by 1365, covering all Holy Roman tournaments. Chroniclers note a 40% drop in accidental impalements. Progress. But creativity thrives. Knights drink the night before, claiming residual courage. Others bribe marshals with flasks of the good stuff. One duke installs a hydration tent with only water. Knights riot, demanding combat juice. You're there for the riot. It ends with a knight challenging the water barrel to a duel. The barrel wins by not showing up. Brother Anselm becomes a minor celebrity. Pilgrims visit his monastery, seeking blessings against wayward lances. He writes a treatise on divine protection, illustrated with a cartoon of himself mid-flight. You flip through it in the Abbey Library. His expression is pure, not again. Historians still argue whether the law reduced drunkenness or just pushed it underground. Tavern records show a spike in pre-dawn drinking. The law evolves. By 1400, some tournaments require knights to swear a sobriety oath on a relic, usually a saint's fingerbone. Break it, and you're excommunicated until you donate a new chapel. One knight donates a privy instead. The bishop accepts, but makes him clean it for a year. You smell the justice from the stands. You wander the lists years later. The grass is greener, the monks safer. Hinrich, sobered by shame or fines, becomes a judge. Ironic, he sniffs helms with gusto, once disqualifying himself for nostalgic vapors. The crowd loves it. The law's legacy, safer jousts, creative cheating, and the birth of medieval designated drivers, squires who carry water skins and judgmental stares. The quirky closure, a 1380s tournament in Cologne, sees a knight try to loophole the law by claiming he's drunk on the Holy Spirit. The marshal, unimpressed, makes him recite the creed while standing on one foot. He falls into a dung heap, disqualified. You're still laughing as the sun sets, painting the sky the color of watered wine. One plastered noble, one airborne monk, one law to sober them all. Proof that even in armor, stupidity finds a way. But now, it has to pass a breath test. You're in the bustling heart of 14th century London, the air thick with wood smoke, horse manure, and the warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread drifting from a dozen ovens. The street is a riot of color. Merchants in dyed wool, apprentices in flour-dusted aprons, and housewives haggling over loaves still steaming from the bakehouse. You shoulder past a fishmonger, shouting about cod fit for a king, and duck into a narrow shop where the baker, a ruddy-cheeked man named Thomas at Croon, is sliding a tray of golden loaves into the brick oven. This one's special, perfectly round, with a decorative ring scored around the top crust, gleaming like a crown under the firelight. Thomas beams. He's outdone himself. You snag a warm end crust, still crackling, and bite in. It's heavenly, the mainstream fact. The assize of bread and ale, enacted in 1266 and enforced for centuries, strictly regulated the weight, quality, and price of every loaf, sold in England to prevent fraud and famine. Word spreads fast. By noon, the market is abuzz. Royal bread, a customer shouts. Another jokes, fit for His Majesty's table. You're licking butter from your fingers when a royal sergeant shoves through the crowd. Eyes locked on Thomas's display, the ringed loaf looks suspiciously like King Richard II's crown. Same circlet, same embossed pattern. In a city where treason can be whispered in a pun, this is dynamite. The sergeant seizes the baker, the loaves, and, because medieval efficiency, your half-eaten crust as evidence, you trail the commotion to the Guildhall. where Thomas is dragged before a magistrate who looks like he swallowed a lemon. The charge: insolent baking that mocks the image and authority of the crown. You squeeze onto a bench, the room packed with bakers, clerks, and one very confused pigeon that flew in through the window. Thomas, flour still in his beard, protests innocence. "It's just a pretty loaf," he pleads. The prosecutor, a lawyer with a voice like a rusty hinge, counters that symbolism is sedition. This ring aped the royal diadem, treason in dough. Witnesses testify. A fishwife claims she bowed to the bread. A child says it looked kingly. Your stifling giggles. This is pastry persecution. The quirky tidbit: medieval bakers were already heavily fined for short weight. But this is the first recorded case of a loaf accused of lèse-majesté. Historians still argue whether the resemblance was deliberate satire or pure coincidence. The Bakers' Guild records hint Thomas was known for fancy scoring to boost sales. The trial is swift. The jury, 12 merchants who'd rather be at lunch, deliberates over ale and, ironically, plain loaves. Guilty. Sentence: a crushing fine, public humiliation, in the stocks, with the offending bread hung around his neck like a millstone, and a ban on any loaf bearing royal or sacred resemblance in shape or design. You're in the Cheapside stocks the next day, the sun beating down as Thomas sits locked in wood, the crown loaf now stale and pecked by crows. Passers-by pelt him with rotten cabbage and witty insults. All hail King Krusty. A minstrel composes a ditty on the spot. You hum along. The law is carved into the Bakers' Guild charter. By week's end, no crowns, no crosses, no halos and dough. Creativity is now a crime. You visit the Guildhall archives years later, watching a scribe copy the ordinance. He rolls his eyes. Bread treason. What next? The rule spreads. York bakers are fined for mitre-shaped manchets. A Cornish pasty maker is scolded for a pie that looked like St. Michael's shield. One fringe chronicle claims a 1390s baker in Bristol tried a loophole. Loaves shaped like the king's foot. The magistrate wasn't amused. Fined for soul mockery. You picture the pun and groan. Enforcement is relentless. Inspectors prowl bakehouses with rulers and pattern books of forbidden shapes. One baker's sunburst loaf is confiscated for resembling the royal orb. Another's braided challah-style bread is banned for Jewish symbolism. Anti-Semitism baked in. You're in a Southwark shop when an inspector measures a cottage loaf's top knot. It's half an inch too regal. The baker pays up, muttering about dough despots. The quirky detail: some bakers retaliate with protest loaves, perfectly round but with a tiny bite taken out, symbolizing rebellion. The crown ignores it. Even tyrants need breakfast. The law's legacy is a bland breadscape. English loaves become uniform discs or rectangles. Creativity crushed under the assize. You taste a post-ban loaf. Dense, honest, but dull. Thomas, ruined, switches to brewing ale. At least liquid can't wear a crown. His old shop becomes a tavern called the Humble Crust. You drink there one night. The walls painted with murals of the infamous loaf. Patrons toast to bread without borders. The church backs the law. Sacred shapes are for hosts, not hunger. One bishop preaches that God's image is not for sale by the pound. You wander London's bakeries decades later. The ringed loaf is myth. Apprentices whisper of it like forbidden magic. One bold soul tries a revival in 1420. Immediately fined. Stocks the works. The ordinance stays on the books until the 19th century, a 500-year carb curb. Historians still argue whether the original loaf was political protest or marketing genius. Guild ledgers show Thomas's sales doubled before the bust. The broader impact? It's the first anti-satire law in culinary history. Puns become perilous. A pie shaped like a bishop's hat lands a baker in the pillory. Pastry rebellion is real. One 15th century uprising allegedly starts over a tyrant tart. You're at a secret bakehouse where rebels craft crown loaves under cover of night, smuggling them to sympathizers. The thrill is yeastier than the bread. You linger in Cheapside. The stock's long gone. A new baker sells plain loaves, but winks when you ask for the special. He slips you a roll with a faint ring scratched in. Subtle defiance. The law endures, but so does human mischief. One decorative loaf, one paranoid crown, one law to flatten them all. Proof that in medieval England, even your sandwich could start a revolution. You're curled in the shadowed cloister of a 14th century Benedictine abbey in Lombardy. The stone cool beneath your bare feet, the air heavy with incense, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of fermenting wine drifting from the cellar. It's well past Compline, the hour when good monks should be snoring in their dormitory. But tonight, the chapel glows with contraband candlelight. A dozen black-robed figures huddle around a single psalter, heads close, voices low and honeyed. They're not praying, at least not the approved version. One monk, Brother Matteo, a tenor with mischief in his eyes, slips a tavern ballad into the Gregorian chant. O maiden fair with eyes of flame. The others catch the rhythm, harmonies blooming like forbidden roses. You're pressed against a pillar, heart thumping, tasting the thrill of rebellion on the midnight air. The mainstream fact: Gregorian chant was the rigid soundtrack of medieval monastic life, strictly monophonic and Latin only, until polyphony crept in during the 12th and 14th centuries, often against church rules. Matteo's voice soars, the others weave beneath him, and suddenly Vespers sounds like a love song smuggled from Verona. The abbot, old Father Gregorio, pretends not to notice for weeks. He's half-deaf and fully fond of his afternoon nap, but one dawn he shuffles into the cloister and catches two monks rehearsing Saint Cecilia's eyes with finger symbols hidden in their sleeves. You watch his face cycle from confusion to fury. That night, he summons the entire choir, delivers a sermon on temptation that could peel paint, and lays down monastic law, one of the new regime. No singing or musical performance shall occur after the hour of sunset. The world's first medieval noise curfew is born. Historians still argue whether Gregorio was genuinely scandalized or secretly jealous he couldn't hit the high notes. The Abbey expense rolls show a suspicious spike in throat lozenges that month. You're in the scriptorium the next morning, watching a sleepy scribe copy the decree in crimson ink. The quill scratches like an angry cat. The rule spreads faster than gossip about the prioress's cat. Neighboring abbeys adopt it verbatim. One adds a bell schedule, so precise you could set an astrolabe by it. The quirky tidbit: monks retaliate with a silent rebellion, whistling the forbidden tune through pursed lips during chapter meetings. One brother, Fra Luca, perfects a whistle so pure it makes the candles flicker. The abbot finds him 3 days of bread and water silence. Luca spends it composing whistle variations in his head. Enforcement is creative torment. A silence warden patrols the corridors with a lantern and a switch, empowered to rap knuckles for any note after dark. You trail him one night. He catches a novice humming the Kyrie in the privy. The boy is sentenced to copy the entire rule of Saint Benedict by candlelight. Ironically, another monk sneaks a lute into the chapel. The strings are confiscated and restrung as fishing line for the kitchen. The abbot declares it divine redistribution. You taste the fish the next Friday. Tastes like rebellion with lemon. The curfew births a golden age of covert composition. Monks scribble polyphony on scraps of parchment, hiding them in psalters or under floorboards. One fragment you find tucked in a hymnal reads, "If silence is golden, let our hearts be vaults." By 1380, the abbey accidentally pioneers early Italian polyphony. Historians later call it the Lombard lament style, never guessing it was forged in teenage defiance and candle wax. The quirky detail: a visiting cardinal hears the forbidden harmonies at prime, mistakes them for angelic intervention, and demands an encore. The abbot blames echoes from the crypt and bans echoes too. You're in the chapter house months later when the rule is read aloud for the 100th time. The monks' mouths twitch. One sneezes the opening bar of Maiden Fair. The abbot glares so hard his eyebrows merge. Penances escalate. Fasting, extra psalms, copying the same decree 50 times. One brother, Fra Tommaso, copies it in the shape of a lute. Exquisite calligraphy, instant flagellation. The parchment is nailed to the refectory door as a warning. Monks file past it daily, tracing the curves with guilty eyes. The ban survives centuries. By 1450, it's copied into every Benedictine customary, from Sicily to Scotland. Rome issues a papal nudge. Let monks sing soberly, not seductively. You imagine the cardinal dictating that line while sipping Chianti. Some abbeys install sound traps, hanging wool drapes to muffle rogue notes. One monastery in Tuscany goes full fortress. Iron grills over the choir stalls, keys held by the abbot's pet raven. The bird squawks the Kyrie at dawn. The monks claim it's possessed and demand an exorcism. The raven keeps the keys. You slip into the abbey church, one forbidden twilight. The silence is thick enough to chew. Then, faint, defiant, a single whistle drifts from the wine cellar. Fra Luca, gray now but unbroken, salutes you with a wink. The tune is Saint Cecilia's Eyes, slower, sadder, but still alive. You whistle the harmony under your breath. The stones seem to hum. Historians still argue whether the curfew stifled or sparked the Italian Ars Nova. Surviving manuscripts show polyphony exploding after the ban, like musical whack-a-mole. The abbey burns in 1492. Ironic, since the monks had finally mastered silent fire drills. The rule dies with the rafters, but the music escapes. Traveling minstrels carry the melodies to courts. Palestrina will later polish them into perfection, never knowing they were born in teenage rebellion and candle stubs. You stand in the ruins years later, ash soft underfoot, and swear you hear a distant whistle on the wind. One lovesick monk, one furious abbot, one law to hush them all. Proof that even holiness has a bedtime. And sometimes the night sings anyway. You're knee-deep in the lush meadows of 15th century rural England. The summer sun baking the earth so fiercely that the grass crackles underfoot and the air shimmers like a mirage. Lord Humphrey of Catterick's prized carp pond glints ahead. a mirror of liquid gold, where fat fish glide like lazy nobles. Humphrey himself stands at the water's edge, coattails flapping, stroking his beard and murmuring sweet nothings to a carp he's named Sir Reginald. You're perched on a stile, munching an apple, watching the scene with the bemused detachment of someone who's seen medieval nobility take pets too far. The mainstream fact: medieval fish ponds were symbols of wealth and piety. Monasteries and lords stocked them with carp, a delicacy introduced from the continent in the 14th century and carefully managed under strict laws. The trouble starts the morning after the village festival. Humphrey strides to the pond at dawn, expecting his finny courtiers to greet him with their usual languid flips. Instead, the carp are off. Sir Reginald swims in erratic circles. Another bumps nose first into a lily pad, and a third breaches the surface with a burp that sounds suspiciously like a tavern belch. Humphrey's face cycles from confusion to outrage. "They're drunk," he thunders. The reeve, a harried man named Watt, pokes the water with a stick. The fish do indeed seem unusually jolly. Gills flushed, eyes glassy. Humphrey declares war. The villagers, in their revelry, must have poured ale into the pond. His ale. You trail the lord to the manor hall, where he summons the village elders like a general before battle. Their defense: "We were drunk, not the fish," falls on deaf ears. A court is convened in the tithe barn, hay bales for benches, a trestle table for the bench. Humphrey presides, Watt prosecutes, and a sheepish priest acts as clerk. Witnesses testify. A cooper saw bubbles of a suspicious froth. A milkmaid claims Sir Reginald winked at her. You're wedged between two smelly shepherds, trying not to laugh. The elders insist the fish were simply sluggish from the heat. Carp are cold-blooded after all. Humphrey counters that cold-blooded creatures don't hiccup. The quirky tidbit: medieval chroniclers record multiple cases of aquatic inebriation, including a 1422 Flemish incident where eels were accused of stealing communion wine. Historians still argue whether Humphrey genuinely believed the fish were tipsy or just needed an excuse to find the village. Pond records show his carp yields had been poor all season. The verdict is swift: guilty of willful inebriation of aquatic life. Sentence: a collective fine of 10 shillings. The pond drained and refilled at village expense, and a new ordinance nailed to every church door: let no man or woman pour ale, wine, or spirituous drink into waters wherein swim the creatures of the Lord. The first animal sobriety law is born. You're in the scriptorium, watching the scribe copy it, his quill trembling, partly from laughter, partly because Humphrey's glaring over his shoulder. Enforcement is immediate. Pond patrols are established. 2 villagers with lanterns must walk the banks after dusk, sniffing for fermentation. One night, they catch a boy tossing apple cores, close enough to cider. He's fined a penny. The quirky detail: neighboring lords adopt the rule, but some tweak it for profit. Lord Bertram of neighboring Swafford charges fish tithes in ale, then accuses the fish of drinking it. You visit his pond. The carp look suspiciously smug. You're at the refilled pond weeks later. The water's crystal, the fish sober. Humphrey lectures Sir Reginald on temperance while feeding him breadcrumbs soaked in spring water. The village grumbles, but pays. The law spreads. By 1460, half of Yorkshire has drunken fish clauses. One estate bans fruit near ponds. Rotting apples could ferment. A brewer is fined for suspicious proximity. When his cart overturns near a stream, you taste the justice, bitter as dregs. The irony, a later chronicler reveals the carp were simply overheated. Carps slow down in warm water, appearing sluggish. Humphrey refuses to believe it, claims the fish were faking sobriety to avoid blame. You're in the manor years later, reading the pond ledger. Yields improve. Fines fund a new dovecote. The law stays on the books for decades. Cited in 1488, when a monk is accused of baptizing trout in mead. The trout are absolved. The monk is not. You linger by the pond at twilight, dragonflies skimming the surface. Sir Reginald glides past, gives you a look that says, "I was never drunk." The village still tells the tale around fires, how one hot day birthed a law against tipsy fish, proof that medieval logic could misread a burp and legislate it into eternity. You're standing in the shadow of a brand new church tower in the French town of Autumn, 1324, the air ringing with the triumphant clang of a massive bronze bell just hoisted into place. The townsfolk have turned out in their Sunday best, silk ribbons, polished boots, and children waving sprigs of rosemary for luck. The bell itself is a masterpiece. 2 tons of gleaming metal, chased with saints and Latin inscriptions that cost the parish a small fortune. You're crammed against the church steps, craning to see the bishop raise his crozier for the blessing. Incense curls. The choir sings. And then the bell ringer gives the first ceremonial pull. The sound is pure glory, deep, rolling, shaking the cobblestones, like God clearing his throat. The mainstream fact: church bells were sacred objects in medieval Europe, baptized with names and godparents, and their ringing marked every moment of communal life, from dawn to curfew. The celebration is short-lived. A summer storm barrels in from nowhere. Black clouds, howling wind, and a crack of lightning that turns noon to midnight. The bolt strikes the tower dead center. You smell ozone and scorched stone. The bell's supporting beam splinters with a sound like a giant's spine snapping. The great bronze monster tears free, crashes through the belfry floor, and begins its escape. You watch, mouth agape, as it bounces down the church steps. Clang, 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 crushing market stalls, flattening a chicken coop, and sending a fruit cart spinning like a top. It finally wedges itself in a pile of melons, still humming with indignation. The crowd is silent. Then someone whispers, "The bell has fled its sacred duty." In medieval France, that's all it takes. The mayor convenes an emergency council in the smoke-filled town hall. You squeeze in beside a blacksmith, still clutching his hammer. The debate is heated. Was the bell possessed? A divine omen? The bishop insists it's merely physics. But the townsfolk want action. By nightfall, a decree is nailed to the church door. All church bells shall henceforth be bound with chains or cords to prevent ungodly flight. The law of runaway bells is born. Historians still argue whether the autumn bell was the first documented escapee, or if earlier incidents were hushed up to avoid panic. Parish records mention a 1298 wandering chime in Normandy, but the details are suspiciously vague. You're in the forge, the next dawn, sparks flying, as blacksmiths hammer iron links thick as your wrist. Every bell in town gets shackled, some with elegant chains, others with rough rope that frays within a month. The quirky tidbit One parish priest blesses the chains with holy water and names them after saints. St. Michael's chain becomes famous for squeaking during high winds, sounding like an angelic complaint. The law spreads faster than plague rumors. By 1350, cathedrals from Paris to Provence are bolting bells so tightly they can barely swing. Pilgrims complain the peal is muffled. One bishop retorts that God hears intention, not volume. Enforcement is relentless. Bell inspectors, yes, that's a job now. Travel circuits with measuring tapes and plumb lines. A bell found with a loose link earns the ringer a fine and a public lecture on metallic morality. You trail one inspector to a village where the bell hangs by a single frayed cord. The ringer swears it's symbolic restraint. The inspector chains it anyway, muttering about symbolic lawsuits. The quirky detail. Some towns overcompensate. Chartres Cathedral reportedly uses so many chains the bell looks like a prisoner in a dungeon. The ringing becomes a dull thunk. Parishioners start bringing earplugs to Mass. You're in autumn decades later. The rogue bell, long since rehung and triple-chained. Tourists still point to the dent in the market square where it landed. Children reenact the escape. With pots and pans, parents shush them, fearing another omen. The law evolves. By 1400, new bells must be cast with built-in anchor rings. Founders grumble about the extra bronze, but orders boom. One crafty smith markets flight-proof bells at double price, complete with a lifetime guarantee against divine intervention. The broader impact. Bells become symbols of captivity as much as community. Priests preach sermons on the chained tongue of the Lord, turning metallurgy into metaphor. You're in a scriptorium, copying a treatise that argues bells, like souls, need restraint to serve properly. The monk, illuminating the margin, draws a bell with angel wings, then hastily scratches them out when the abbot walks by. You linger at twilight, the chained bells tolling a muted curfew. The sound is softer, safer, but somehow less alive. One storm, one lightning strike, one law to clip the wings of bronze. Proof that in medieval France, even metal needed supervision. And sometimes the heavens themselves had to be grounded. You are crouched in a dusty Castilian tavern in the late 12th century, the air thick with wood smoke, sour wine, and the low rumble of theological debate. The room is lit by a single tallow lamp that gutters every time the door swings open. At the center table, Father Rodrigo Davar, a priest with a beard like a bird's nest and eyes sharp as communion knives, leans across the scarred oak toward a knight named Don Alvaro de Luna. The argument started innocently. Could St. Michael defeat a mortal warrior in single combat? 5 pints in, it's personal. Alvaro calls a Rodrigo a coward in cloth. Rodrigo slams his cup down, wine sloshing like blood. May God strike you down, he growls. Or failing that, I shall. You're wedged between two merchants, pulse racing, because everyone knows where this is going. The mainstream fact: trial by combat was a legally sanctioned method of settling disputes in medieval Iberia, rooted in Germanic custom and endorsed by the Church until the 13th century. Dawn breaks cold and clear over a fallow field outside Toledo. You're bundled in a wool cloak, breath fogging as the two men square off. Alvaro is a tower of mail and muscle, lance gleaming, horse snorting steam. Rodrigo stands in his black cassock, clutching a sword that still has candle wax on the hilt from last night's vigil. The crowd, peasants, monks, a few curious nobles, forms a ragged circle. A herald reads the terms. First blood, no killing. God decides. You stifle a laugh. Rodrigo opens with a blessing, crossing himself like he's at mass. The quirky tidbit: chroniclers swear Rodrigo's sword was a repurposed reliquary blade, once used to cut communion bread. The bishop later confiscates it for inappropriate multitasking. The fight is over in 3 heartbeats. Alvaro charges. Rodrigo sidesteps, pure luck or divine reflex, and swings. The flat of his blade cracks Alvaro's helm, sending the knight sprawling into the dirt. The crowd erupts. Alvaro yields, ego bruised worse than his skull. Rodrigo raises his sword to heaven, shouting, Deus vult. You're cheering with the rest, half in awe, half in terror. The church, however, is not amused. Word reaches the Bishop of Toledo within the hour. He convenes a council in the cathedral chapter house, stone walls echoing with outrage. A priest defeating a knight in judicial combat? Unthinkable, not sinful, embarrassing. It sets a precedent. Clergy settling scores with steel instead of scripture. You're in the chapter house days later, watching scribes draft the decree in crimson ink. No servant of God shall henceforth bear arms, nor engage in duel, trial by combat, or violent sport, under pain of suspension and penance. The medieval church's HR policy is born. Historians still argue whether the ban was immediate empire-wide or phased in. Castilian records show it enforced by 1190, while French clergy keep dueling into the 14th century. The quirky detail: some priests loophole the rule by fighting with staves, technically not arms. One monk in Salamanca wins a land dispute by clubbing a baron unconscious with a crozier. The bishop sighs, adds no blunt instruments to the next edition. Enforcement is spotty but theatrical. Rodrigo is stripped of his sword, promoted to cathedral librarian. A pen is mightier and safer. The bishop quips. Alvaro limps away, muttering about holy cheating. The ban spreads. By 1200, every diocese in Castile has a copy nailed to the sacristy door. Priests caught with weapons face defrocking. One is found with a dagger hidden in his psalter and sentenced to copy the entire Vulgate by hand, in silence. You visit the scriptorium years later. The priest's fingers are ink-stained nubs, but his calligraphy is flawless. The law evolves. Warrior monks like the Templars ignore it entirely. Papal privilege. Ordinary parish priests get the message. Next time someone calls you a coward, mutter, canon law forbids it, and walk away. The story of Father Rodrigo becomes legend. Some say his sword was reforged into a crucifix and hung in Toledo Cathedral. Others claim he was quietly sainted for unorthodox defense of the faith. You stand beneath the crucifix one afternoon. Sure enough, the blade's outline is visible in the silver, a subtle wink from history. You linger in the cathedral close at dusk. The bands echo in every silent priest. One drunken duel, one lucky swing, one law to disarm the clergy forever. Proof that sometimes holiness and hand-to-hand combat just don't mix. And the church finally drew the line in the sand, not with a sword, but with parchment. You're huddled in a quiet hamlet along the Rhine in 13th century Germany. The evening mist curling off the river like a ghost's breath, and the last light of day bleeding into the water. The biggest excitement most nights is the creak of the mill wheel or a cow lowing for its calf. Then comes Hans the shepherd, lungs like church organs, lips pursed into a whistle that could wake the dead, or at least summon every demon within a mile. He whistles hymns, bird calls, and his own invention, the tune of the wind, from dawn till dusk, and fatally, long after the evening bell has tolled for silence, you're leaning against a half-timbered wall, nursing a mug of warm ale, when Hans launches into a piercing rendition of Ave Maria that rattles the shutters. Somewhere, a baby wails. Somewhere else, a dog howls in harmony. The mainstream fact: medieval towns enforced strict curfews and noise ordinances to maintain public order, with bells signaling the end of the workday and the start of quiet hours. The breaking point comes one moonless night. Hans, herding his flock across the town bridge, whistles a jaunty reel. The sound startles the horses of a passing noblewoman's carriage. The animals bolt, the carriage lurches, and the lady, Countess Adelheid von Hohenstein, plunges straight into the icy Rhine. She's fished out drenched, furious and smelling of river mud. By morning, the town council convenes in the rat house, candlelight flickering on grim faces. You squeeze onto a bench between a baker and a tanner. Adelheid, wrapped in furs and indignation, demands justice. Hans, summoned in his shepherd's smock, argues that his whistle soothes the sheep and pleases the Lord. The mayor, whose own sleep has been shattered for weeks, isn't swayed. The verdict is swift. No man, woman, or child shall whistle in public after the toll of the evening bell. Upon pain of fine and public censure, the law of forbidden whistles is born. You're in the town scribe's chamber the next day, watching the decree copied onto parchment, still warm from the sheep it came from. The ink smells sharp, the scribe's hand trembling. He's a secret whistler himself. The rule spreads faster than the tune that caused it. By 1280, every Rhine Valley town has a copy nailed to the church door. Enforcement is delightfully petty. Night watchmen carry wooden clappers and a list of approved sounds: coughing, praying, snoring, whistling. Never. One watchman catches Hans, a week later, mid-gloria, outside the tavern. The fine: 3 loaves and a flagon of ale. The medieval parking ticket Hans pays, but not before whistling the receipt into the mayor's ear. The quirky tidbit: some towns claim nighttime whistling attracts witches or tax collectors, equally feared. One chronicle records a 1302 incident where a whistler is accused of summoning a storm. The storm arrives anyway, and the whistler is acquitted, but banned from high notes. You're on patrol with a watchman years later. He carries a whistle trap, a small cage with a decoy bird that sings on command. It works once. The bird learns Hans's tune and refuses to stop. The watchman frees it in despair. The law evolves into a symphony of silence. Curfews tighten. By 1350, entire provinces outlaw all nocturnal noise, including lute playing and overly enthusiastic lovemaking. One town ledger notes, "The silence is unbearable. The sheep now cry at night." The rule is partially repealed. Whistling allowed for shepherds only between sheep and home. No detours. Hans becomes a local hero, his tune carved into the bridge railing as a subtle act of defiance. You trace the notes with your finger, they still seem to hum. You linger on the bridge at twilight decades later, the river black and glassy. The evening bell tolls, and the town falls hush, almost From the fields, a faint, defiant whistle drifts in on the wind. Hans is long gone, but his melody lingers. One shepherd's lungs, one soggy countess, one law to mute them all. Proof that in medieval Germany, even joy had a curfew, and sometimes the night still sings back. You're wedged into a smoky tavern in Bruges, 1435, the kind of place where the beer is stronger than the floorboards, and the patrons argue in 3 languages at once. The room is lit by a single whale oil lamp that swings like a drunk pendulum, throwing shadows across faces already red from drink and debate. At the center table sits Master Jan van Eyck. Yes, the Van Eyck, the painter who makes gold leaf look humble, nursing a cup of spiced wine and sketching on a scrap of vellum. Across from him is a wool merchant named Pieter de Kock, a man whose beard is so magnificent it has its own postal code. The argument started over pigment prices, but has spiraled into art theory. Can a portrait truly capture the soul if the sitter's nose is crooked? Jan insists yes. Peter insists no. You're leaning against the bar, ale sloshing. When Peter slams his fist down and bellows, "Your noses are an insult to honest Flemish faces," Jan, calm as a cathedral, replies, "Then let the noses duel." The room erupts. The mainstream fact. Portraiture exploded in 15th century Flanders thanks to oil paint and wealthy patrons, but no law governed aesthetic accuracy until this very night. By dawn, the tavern has emptied into the town square. You're wrapped in a borrowed cloak, breath fogging in the chill, as Jan and Peter face off beneath the belfry. Each holds a rolled-up portrait, Jan's of Peter, Peter's of Jan, done in haste on oak panels the size of prayer books. The rules are simple. The crowd votes. Which nose is truer to life? Loser pays for a round for the entire square and publicly apologizes to the winner's proboscis. The quirky tidbit, Jan's portrait of Peter is so lifelike that a dog later tries to sniff it. Peter's of Jan makes the painter look like a disappointed herring. Historians still argue whether the duel was genuine artistic critique or just an excuse to drink more. The tavern ledger shows the bar tab tripled that night. The crowd, merchants, monks, a confused tourist from Venice inspects the panels like judges at a livestock fair. Peter's nose on Jan's panel is a noble aquiline ridge. Jan's nose on Peter's panel resembles a potato that lost a fight with a grater. Laughter ripples. The vote is unanimous. Jan wins. Peter, redder than his wine, mutters, "Fine, but no more crooked noses in Bruges." He storms to the town hall, still clutching his losing portrait, and demands a law. The aldermen, hungover but amused, convene in the council chamber. You slip in through a side door, the air thick with ink and indignation. By noon, a decree is nailed to every Guildhall door. No painter, limner, or artisan shall depict the nose of any citizen in exaggerated, deformed, or satirical proportion, upon pain of fine and destruction of the offending work. The world's first anti-caricature ordinance is born. You're in the scriptorium that afternoon, watching the scribe copy the law in Gothic letters so ornate they look like noses themselves. The ink smells of oak galls and revenge. The rule spreads faster than gossip about the Duke's new mistress. By 1440, every Flemish town has a nose inspector, an official with a ruler and a very straight face, who visits studios unannounced. One painter is caught adding a wart to a burgomaster's snout. The panel is publicly burned. and the artist is fined enough to buy the burgomaster a new velvet cap. The quirky detail. Some artists loophole the law by painting noses perfectly, then signing the work upside down so the nose looks like a chin. The inspectors are stumped. The paintings sell for double. Enforcement is a comedy of errors. Jan van Eyck himself is accused when a patron claims his wife's nose leans left in the light. Jan proves it's the light, not the nose, by rotating the panel under a candle. Case dismissed, but the patron still demands a refund. Peter de Kock becomes the unofficial nose czar, roaming ateliers with a magnifying glass. You trail him to a workshop where an apprentice has painted a nobleman with a nose so small it's practically a rumor. Peter declares it satirical subtraction and confiscates the brush. The apprentice retaliates by painting Peter's beard as a hedgehog. The hedgehog is later adopted as the guild mascot. The law evolves into a golden age of bland portraiture. Noses become uniform, straight, and suspiciously symmetrical. One critic complains that Bruges faces now look interchangeable as guild tokens. Artists flee to Italy, where noses can be heroic, tragic, or downright Roman. Back home, the ordinance is cited in 1472, when a miniaturist is fined for a prayer book illumination of St. Peter with a hooked proboscis of doubt. The saint's nose is scraped off. The book is rebound with a blank space where divine nostrils should be. You visit Jan's studio years later. He's old, hands trembling, but still painting on his easel. A self-portrait with a nose so perfect it could rule a kingdom. He winks. Peter never checked the mirror. The law stays on the books until the 18th century, when caricature finally wins. But in Bruges, they still tell the tale. One tavern duel, two crooked noses, one law to straighten them all. Proof that in the golden age of Flemish art, even beauty had to be legislated. And sometimes, the nose knows best.